Today's story is about a real person from history. It's about the 11th century philosopher and guru Ramanuj. We'll see that even in the 11th century, academia was a rather dangerous profession, including assassination attempts, exorcism, having your belongings stolen by your professor, and sticking your hand into a snake's mouth. Welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast that will take you on a journey through the rich mythology, folklore, and history of the Indian subcontinent. I am Narad Muni, the celestial storyteller and the original Time Lord. With my ability to travel through space and time, I can bring you fascinating stories of the past, the present, and the future. From the epic tales of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to the folk tales of the Panchatantra, to stories of Akbar Birbal and Tenali Raman, I have a story for every occasion. The purpose of the stories is neither to pass judgment nor to indoctrinate. My goal is only to share these stories with people who may not have heard them before, and to make them more entertaining for those who have. If you think about dangerous academic institutions, a number of different places spring to mind. The dangers at Hogwarts might be mostly from the school administration that punish students by sending them into the forbidden forest at midnight, just because they were being unsafe by walking in the school grounds in the evening. Or the Jedi Academy from the Star Wars universe, where it was more than possible to accidentally or even intentionally cut your classmates with lightsabers. Or Professor X's School for the Gifted from the X-Men series, where students were under constant fire, both literal and figurative, either from a world full of hostile mutants trying to fight/recruit students, or from the minority non-mutant humans in the world. Well, I have a fourth institution of learning that could give all of these places a run for their money. It was in the unlikely setting of 11th century India, a time of peace apparently, but not in academia. Today, we'll hear the story of a person who overcame several assassination attempts, including one from his own professor. The location is Sri Perumbudur. This is where a baby was born. His parents probably had considered him more of a sidekick for his older brother. That's why they named him Ramanuj, which literally means Ram's younger brother. That might seem an awkward way to start out in life, but that did not stop Ramanuj. In his childhood, he preferred to play with his cousin Govind. Together, the two of them were like dal chawal or chole bhature. Tough, but not impossible to imagine one without the other. Ramanuj's parents were enthusiastic about his higher education, and so were eagerly waiting for the day he got his letter. This wasn't the Hogwarts type of letter delivered by owl, but it was a letter to join the prestigious Yadav Prakash Academy. And it wasn't just him. Both Ramanuj and Govind had applied and been accepted. Now, being accepted into an academic institution in 11th century India is not as straightforward as it is in 21st century India. Admission wasn't gated on a single entrance exam. It depended on a number of factors: how rich your family was, how likely you were to give the Guru your Guru Dakshina, and it unfortunately also depended on caste, gender, and age. Some of you might remember what happened to Ekalavya in the Mahabharata. Ramanuj understood these arbitrary criteria, but he wasn't in a position to do anything about it until much later in his life. So, anyway, Ramanuj and Govind both got glowing responses to their application. Here, let me read it to you. Dear parents, it gives me great pleasure to inform you that your child's application to study at the Yadav Prakash Academy at Kanchi has been accepted after a thorough review by our board. Please send your child, Ramanuj, with supplies and money. See Appendix A for a list of supplies, Appendix B for school timings, and Appendices C through H for a list of fees. You have brought your money into this world, nurtured him, and taught him some essential skills. Now he is in our safe hands and will learn from Professor Yadav Prakash himself, the greatest authority on Vishnu. Signed, Yadav Prakash. This letter is printed on recycled leaves. The accidental use of the word money instead of child was an understandable slip. Not unlike some modern educational institutions, money was a motivating factor for some gurus, and in particular with Yadav Prakash. It seemed like a good thing in the beginning, even if Yadav Prakash was a little full of himself. You probably guessed that from the letter. He was the school's principal, its entire board, its admissions officer, and also he was all its teachers. With him and his ego, there really wasn't room on the faculty for anyone else. But a point in Yadav Prakash's favor. He was generous enough to share the burden with the students, so they got to do the janitorial and caretaker duties. Yadav Prakash claimed to be the greatest authority on Vishnu. However, Ramanuj began to doubt that. And what was worse and unforgivable was that Ramanuj began to call out Yadav Prakash's mistakes. Ramanuj wasn't deliberately trying to be pedantic, and he wasn't deliberately trying to show off his own knowledge. But when Yadav Prakash contradicted himself, Ramanuj could not help himself. He had to point out that in today's lecture, around the 2-hour, 23-minute mark, Yadav Prakash had directly contradicted the statement he made in last week's lecture on a similar topic. Yadav Prakash did not take this feedback kindly, and he scolded Ramanuj for being an insufferable know-it-all. If you've ever wondered where Professor Snape from Harry Potter learned to treat his students, it was probably from Yadav Prakash. Where Yadav Prakash had a leg up on Snape, however, was that he actively tried to murder his student. And what's more, he recruited some of the other students in the plot, including some Draco Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle stand-ins, and Govind. It goes to show that Yadav Prakash wasn't competent enough to know that Ramanuj and Govind were cousins and lifelong friends. Or maybe the professor did know and expected his position as guru to overcome any sense of loyalty that Govind might feel for his cousin. But Govind was determined to save Ramanuj. So that evening, when the guru took them on a field trip into the forest, Govind ushered his cousin by the elbow and quickly explained that Yadav Prakash was going to have Ramanuj murdered. By golly, you're right, Ramanuj said. Listening to all the inaccuracies in his lecture, it's just plain murder. I'll admit, it's slow murder, but... Ramanuj, you're not listening, Govind interrupted. He's planning to have you physically murdered. Look, he even gave me this book, Murder 101, Execution for the 11th Century Modern Student. He gave copies to everyone except you. He specifically marked out Chapter 7, which teaches drowning and how to make it look like an accident. It took a bit more convincing, but finally, Ramanuj understood the danger that he was in. Maybe what finally convinced him was the future dated copy of his death certificate application. Quietly, while his guru and the other students were sleeping, Ramanuj snuck away. The forest may not seem like an ideal place to go roaming around in the night. That being said, I'm sure you'd understand that wild beasts and venomous snakes and scorpions were probably more friendly than the company of the figurative snake that Yadav Prakash had turned out to be. As Ramanuj wandered, he hadn't yet made up his mind if he wanted to head back to Kanchi or not. He had to complete his education. How else would he learn about Vishnu? He continued walking with only his thoughts for company, until they weren't his only company, because just then he stumbled into a fowler and his wife. And when I say stumbled, I mean that literally, seeing as it was dark in the forest. The three of them made polite conversation. The fowler and his wife said that they were camping out here. And no, they weren't from Kanchi. They had come from a long way off. Their home was a floating one, in an ocean far, far away. Ramanuj remarked at the coincidence when he heard their names were Vishnu and Lakshmi. Just like my favorite deities, Ramanuj said. The next morning, the fowler's wife asked Ramanuj to fetch water for her to drink. Several times. Ramanuj didn't tire though. He patiently made trip after trip to get her a handful of water each time. When he returned with his last handful of water, the fowler and his wife were nowhere to be found, which he thought a bit puzzling. Maybe they had gone back to their floating home in the ocean. Wait a minute. Floating home in the ocean? Names of Vishnu and Lakshmi? Was it possible? Ramanuj rushed back to Kanchi and the Vishnu temple there. As he gazed into the eyes of the idols, he realized that he had indeed met the real Vishnu and Lakshmi. Hats off to the sculptor who had captured the likeness of those two when creating the idols. To Ramanuj, this was a sign from Vishnu that he must persevere. So, assassination attempt or no assassination attempt, mistakes or no mistakes, Ramanuj decided he would go back and learn from Yadav Prakash. Yadav Prakash was surprised to see him back. Who wouldn't be? Imagine if Luke Skywalker went to Darth Vader for training, or if Harry Potter sought out Lord Voldemort, not to fight him, but to be tutored by him. Yadav Prakash couldn't immediately say no. Besides, he was late for an exorcism in the other side of town. So he told Ramanuj to just come along. Yes, this was an exorcism, but not the type that Hollywood features. This was a little simpler. A girl seemed to behave outside of the norms of what was expected of girls at the time. That was not uncommon, seeing as there were many unreasonable restrictions on how women behaved, all imposed by a patriarchal society. Yadav Prakash tried and failed, and told the girl's father that she was a lost cause. He was about to get out his Murder 101 handbook to outline the next steps for the girl's father. But Ramanuj intervened. He chanted a few shlokas about Vishnu, and that magically seemed to cure the girl. The girl's parents were happy. The girl was happy. Ramanuj was happy. Yadav Prakash was not. He was upset specifically because Ramanuj's actions would hurt the Guru's reputation. And then, how was he going to get more students to come join him? Was Ramanuj thinking of a rival school? He'd better not. And if he did, it had better not be about Vishnu. Yadav Prakash didn't want any competition. So with threats, with verbal abuse, Yadav Prakash expelled Ramanuj before he had a chance to resume his studies. That meant Ramanuj was in the market for a new professor. But a new professor is not someone he could find in the 11th century equivalent of the Yellow Pages. He did not have the best of luck in his search. A while later, though, a scholar, Mahapurna, came to recruit him on behalf of Yamunacharya of Sri Rangam. It seemed that Ramanuja's search had come to an end. But by the time that Ramanuj got to Sri Rangam, Yamunacharya had unfortunately passed away. People were mourning him, and they were also puzzled because 3 of Yamunacharya's fingers were folded, and they were trying to figure out what that meant. One of his students speculated that Yamunacharya was making a symbol of a gun. Ordinarily, that might have been laughed off. But, like I said earlier, 11th century academia was filled with dangerous stuff. Another student suggested that the explanation was rather mundane. Yamunacharya was applying his daily sandalwood paste on his forehead, and death caught him in the middle of it. Ramanuj, who had just entered, had a totally different explanation. He said the 3 folded fingers represented 3 unfulfilled desires, and he knew exactly what they were, even though he had never met Yamunacharya before. 1. To pray to God. 2. To write an explanation of the Upanishads. And 3. To spread the teachings of Vishnu. The moment Ramanuj offered this explanation, the 3 fingers on Yamunacharya's corpse straightened out At this point, Yamanacharya's students should have called a doctor to examine him, given he had just moved 3 of his fingers. He must be alive. But they ignored the possibility and spent their time cheering Ramanuj instead. Anyway, Ramanuj wasn't entirely teacherless because he learned from Mahapurna, his recruiter, who had himself learned from Yamanacharya. Thankfully for Ramanuj, these lessons were more standard and did not involve his professor trying to kill him. At the conclusion of his studies, Ramanuj had gained quite a following. Many people were interested in learning wisdom and knowledge from him. He had a way with words. So much so that there was a tug of war between Kanchi and Srirangam. Both wanted him as their resident guru. Even Yadav Prakash, his former professor and would-be assassinator, accepted Ramanuj as his own guru. But this fight was ultimately won by Srirangam. Deviously. Ranga Perumal was a singer from that town, and he visited Kanchi and wowed the crowds with his concerts. The mayor of Kanchi offered him the keys to the city, but the singer had something else in mind. The people of Kanchi shouldn't have agreed to give the singer whatever he wanted, at least not before they heard what it was that he was asking for, because he asked for their permission and support to take Ramanuj to Srirangam. The people of Kanchi had no choice but to give in. The singer's attempts to reassure them that it was only a short 275 kilometers by NH38 didn't quite satisfy them. But what could they do? They didn't have a singer of a similar caliber to win Ramanuj back. Besides, even if they did, the people of Srirangam had invented this trick. They might not fall for it. In Srirangam, Ramanuj's following continued to grow. He'd often do multiple lectures a day, and he'd preach directly to the public. Ramanuj had a massive part to play in teaching people about Vishnu. You might wonder, I am president for life of Vishnu's fan club, and you know that I consider myself his number one fan. How did my Vishnu fan club rank against Ramanuj's? The answer is that it's complicated. Ramanuj was actively teaching people how to live their life using stories of Vishnu. The main focus of my Vishnu fan club, on the other hand, is to show how absolutely awesome Vishnu is. Anyway, on with the story. Ramanuj had started a school of his own, but this was rather different from Yadav Prakash's, in the sense that there wasn't an application, an entrance exam, tuition fees, administration, a school board, all that sort of thing. There was just Ramanuj teaching anyone and everyone who wanted to listen to him. His regular students included many young boys, not unlike how Ramanuj and Govind had been. There was also Dhanurdas, who was part of the king's bodyguard, and Dhanurdas's wife. Dhanurdas and his wife's presence made the rest of the students jealous. They were always complaining to Ramanuj about the couple. Frivolous complaints mostly. And then, one day, when they went bathing, their clothes were missing. That was the last straw. They complained to Ramanuj. Despite having no evidence, they were certain that Dhanurdas and his wife had stolen them. Quite surprisingly, Ramanuj suggested that they go to Dhanurdas's home and recover their clothes from there. So the students went there. When they reached there, Dhanurdas wasn't home and his wife was sleeping. The students couldn't find their clothes, but in their state of agitation, they began taking off the sleeping lady's jewelry to compensate. They managed to take off her bangles and earrings on her left side. Dhanurdas's wife then rolled over and continued sleeping. That would have given the students the opportunity to steal her bangles and earrings on her right side as well. But her movement scared them, and they went away, back to Ramanuj. Ramanuj heard about their experience and suggested they all go on a field trip to Dhanurdas's hut, a learning opportunity for all of them. Quite shockingly, they all eavesdropped on the couple. When Dhanurdas returned, his wife told him about how a few students had come by while she was sleeping. They had taken half her jewelry, and then she had deliberately rolled over so that they could take the other half as well. But they must have gotten scared, and they left in a hurry. Dhanurdas scolded his wife and said that she should have remained still. That way, they wouldn't have been scared, and they would probably have figured out a way to steal the rest of her jewelry. Ramanuj asked his students if, by now, they understood the most important difference between themselves and this couple. These students hadn't given up attachment to the material world the way the husband and wife had. They still cared about their clothes, which incidentally Ramanuj had hidden in order to teach them a lesson. That seemed to clear up the jealousy in most of the students' eyes. But there was one student who resented this practical approach to learning. He developed more than a bit of distrust for his professor. He worried. What if on graduation day he found Ramanuj had hidden his clothes again? Might be quite an embarrassing situation. Obviously, this one student wasn't ready to overcome attachment to the material world. His loss. A few years passed. Ramanuj was out walking one day when he saw a man holding a cobra in his hand, a venomous snake. And his other hand was inside the snake's mouth. Ramanuj was surprised. What was the man doing? He inquired. Well, that stranger turned out to be no stranger. He was Govind, Ramanuj's cousin. Govind said that he would have come and given Ramanuj a hug, or at least a handshake. But as Ramanuj could see, he was occupied at the moment. Govind added that he was removing a thorn from the snake's tongue. It had somehow gotten stuck there, and the snake seemed to be in pain. Ramanuj was obviously curious how Govind was confident that he wouldn't be bitten. To which his cousin replied that he had faith in Vishnu and that all life was sacred. He removed the thorn and put the snake down. The snake waved a polite thank you and said Govind was absolutely right about all life being sacred, and then slithered off, looking for a sacred rat to eat. Govind said he had been looking for Ramanuj, and he wanted to become his follower. Could he please join him? This was a question that Ramanuj had heard thousands of times, and his answer was the same as always: yes. After that, Ramanuja's work consisted of fulfilling Yamunacharya's wish by writing a commentary on the Upanishads, which are sacred texts. Ramanuj also revealed idols that had been buried in the ground, and that led to temples being set up there. Ramanuj talked to merchants that owned other idols as collectibles, and he convinced them to give those up. Finally, when he passed, it was in Srirangam, and after a long life of teaching those around him. They say he lived to the age of 120 years, which likely makes him one of the oldest people ever, even though they measured days a little differently back then. So, give or take a few years. That's it for this time. In the next episode, we'll do an Akbar and Birbal story. We'll see Birbal come out on top, as usual. Thank you all for the comments on social media and on Spotify's Q&A. I can't directly reply to the questions there, but I'll address them here on the show. Thank you Hiranmayi, Raju, Libby and Hariprasad for your heartwarming comments. Thanks Nilima, New Bunny and Sayushi for the feedback. Thanks Prasanna for your question. Technically, Dhritarashtra had 102 children, but 101 of those were with Gandhari. Devilskin, a Chandrakanta story is coming up soon. Anivar, I'll do a Buddha story as well. And I'll start on Purnin Selvan as well. Arush, interesting question about ranking all my episodes. I'd prefer to keep the episodes focused on stories, but maybe what I can do on my site is to publish a list of the top episodes. I've gotten a whole lot of requests from many others as well, to do a story about myself, about Chandrakanta, Akbar Birbal, Ramayan, Mahabharat, Jatak tales, and numerous folk tales from different parts of the country. I just ask for your patience as I get through all of them. If you have any other comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com, or tweet at sfipodcast, or reply to the questions on Spotify's Q&A. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.